Welcome everyone, this is Tim Pullman and you're listening to the SEP Couch. This podcast is all about standard essential patents. We talk about patent strategies, FRAND licensing, patent pooling, and patent litigation. So let's dive into today's episode.
He is the president of the ACT, the App Association. He's also one of the board members of the LESI SDOs. I'm super glad to have here today Morgen Reed. Hello, Morgen. Nice having you.
Absolutely a pleasure to be here. I look forward to a great discussion, and I'm so impressed with your ability to pull in this particularly niche audience on what you and I discussed earlier is a truly multi-billion-dollar part of the global economy. And yet the number of people who know a lot about this issue are essentially your listeners. So billions and even trillions of dollars changing hands, all on the listeners of this podcast.
Oh yeah, we do have a lot of people coming in, listening in, and that is also typically also my first question because it's such an exotic topic. I'm always very interested in how you got into it. So it would be great if you could start, Morgen, with telling us a little bit about your career steps, and where you first got in touch with the world of standard essential patents.
How you get in touch in standards? That's always an interesting question. So I started out like every little boy growing up in Fairbanks, Alaska, 100 miles south of the Arctic Circle. I found a reason to move south. I had the pleasure of going to school for undergraduate at Arizona State University, where I became really interested in what was going on in China and the manufacturing epicenter that was becoming China, especially in the bike industry of all things, bicycles. I spent several years working there, found that I know this will surprise none of your listeners, that the intellectual property realities of China were different than you might expect here in the United States, or in Europe, or in Japan, or in Korea. Came back to the United States, where I was honored to work with the US government and for a member of Congress who had oversight over portions of the International Relations Committee. At the time, we were called the Foreign Affairs Committee, and then basically bounced around from a couple of law firms. I ended up at Venable for a brief period, a few years, before I was approached by the Technology Association that I currently work for, because they had found out one of my secrets. While by day I was working on public policy and international relations issue, at night I was working on the implementation of 802.11b in the Linux kernel. So the secret part of me is I come from the programming side of the world. My father was a computer science professor and teacher, and my first language was 6502 assembly language. I learned to program at a pretty young age, back right after we got the first floppy disk and we moved off of tapes. My dad still had punch cards in our closet. So the trade association that I now represent came to me and said, we heard through the grapevine that you know a thing or two about technology. And in fact, when it comes on the standards issues, that I've actually been working on the implementation and understanding of 802.11b, which for your listeners, you also know as Wi-Fi, which was one of the first kind of fascinating battles around questions of standards, patents, who has the rights. If you recall, early implementations of 802.11, there were questions of whose patent would rule out, which chipset would become the winner. So very early on, my interest in computer science and the work that I was doing, like I said, at night, really dovetailed in with a lot of what I work on now, which is how do you take advantage of what SEPs provide? Well, let me restate what standards provide, which is this platform to launch outrageous, audacious new ideas. And I think that always is the part of the standards world that I find most interesting. The standard itself is a negotiated battle between technologists. But what we can do on top of the standards is where there's real excitement. And so for me, being in this position, representing people who have patents, but also people who are busy trying to come up with the next thing that depends on standards in order to reach the audience it wants to reach, is a real blessing and an opportunity to really merge together some real broad ranges of strange background that I have.
Here you have that technical knowledge of actually understanding and reading those standards. I never could do that, so I'm really impressed by that, and also that you have the experience with being part of this. I think to me it's always so fascinating that this open innovation process, so cooperative, so many companies from all over the world and individuals from all over the world. This is actually something that I feel is often not known to so many people, that that open character and cooperative character of standards development. You joined, or you have been appointed at the App Association. I think that's since over 19 years now.
Yeah, thanks for making me feel old. That's right. Like I said, when I said 802.11b, that should tell you something. That's before we even called it Wi-Fi. Trying to figure out how to implement it on Linux. That was always the interesting part. But yeah, for almost 19 years, working in this intersection between public policy and technology. That's right.
Could you elaborate a little bit about what the App Association is, who are the members, what's the purpose? Explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the App Association started in 1998. I was not there at the founding. Really to give voice to small and medium-sized developers who are finding themselves at the time in a battle between giants, and not dissimilar from what we see on some of the SEP issues as well, where questions of multi-billion-dollar companies were fighting out their antitrust or other battles, and what was ending up happening is the small guy was getting squashed. So our membership is about 5,000 companies, give or take. When you deal with small and medium-sized companies, sometimes they thrive, sometimes they don't. A lot of our guys get acquired, which is amazing and huge opportunities. It's one of the reasons why we love intellectual property, is that the value it provides for acquisition. And so our members really run the gamut. It's an interesting fact that we are the App Association, but the reality of most software is written to help run businesses. Most of the code that is struck today is helping to run factories and point of sale and just-in-time shipping and managing your CRM and all of the myriad details that go on in every business environment. It really is, software is the underpinning of what drives our daily commerce. And so our members do everything from the full stack applications that you see on your phone to the middleware and back-end software that helps to make that all possible. Cloud computing, machine learning, rules engines, all that stuff. So for our members, they are the underpinning of the mobile economy. Right now, we estimate the mobile economy is around $1.7 trillion. It might be closer to 2 trillion now, but all you have to do is think of how many times a day you touch your phone, and you understand why our members are such a critical part of your life, and frankly, the lives of roughly 3 billion people around the world who are using their phones daily. I think we're closer to 4 now, 4 billion. We have members in all 27 member countries in the European Union, all 435 congressional districts in the United States, because that's the other part of all of this, and dovetailing with standards. There's a misperception that technology is the coasts of America, 2 cities in Europe, and maybe a couple of places where the Italians have put some money in to try to drive some innovation centers in, like, Alicante, Spain, a couple of places like that. The reality is there are programmers, developers, software being developed in every nook and cranny of the world that you can think of. We have members in Bulgaria. We have members all over the place that are doing the software that you depend on every day. So I think that's a critical part. We estimate that about 83% of all of the app companies out there exist outside of the traditional tech hubs. So it really is a part of the fabric of your life every day.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I, to be honest, I'm always a bit scared at looking at my screen time of my phone, interacting with all these apps. That is really scary that we spend so much time looking at that.
We can do another podcast called privacy. I
Yeah.
spend that's a huge, a huge chunk of my time is also spent on thinking about privacy issues. So yes, you should think about all those things. That's the right way to be.
I can imagine. And I know that the App Association is touching up on a lot of topics, and but today, as you know from our listeners, we want to focus on a particular one, and that's when patents and standards get together. And you are well aware there's all these heated discussions, even litigation out there. But I'm always interested to understand, when I talk to an association like yours, what are the topics around standard essential patents or FRAND licensing that are most pressing at the moment that your members raise in all these meetings and discussions you have? Right.
I think so. It kind of goes back to the roots of what I said about our members being small and medium-sized businesses. They're also, to no surprise of your listeners, I'm sure, a big part of their lives now is wrapped up in IoT, the Internet of Things, whether it's software for agriculture products, software for healthcare. I spend about 40% of my time working on digital medicine initiatives around the world. Healthcare is massively changing and should, in order to recognize the way that these digital tools can improve our health and our engagement in our health. So healthcare, firefighting, agriculture, all of these issues, what's generally termed IoT, is a critical next wave for my members. And the reason that so many of them have been interested and raised this in our board meeting was primarily, it started with the issue of the change in flavor, where you saw some of the people who had standard essential patents or declared standard essential patents were proffering forth this new idea that it wasn't any willing licensee, but it was that the SEP holder could choose where in the food chain they wanted to put a license. That was incredibly troubling for my members, because oftentimes they're small and medium-sized businesses. What they want to do is be able to source the parts or source the software that they need to use, and then build another product. And the idea that they have to go to their venture capitalists or their grandparents or someone else and say, well, I don't know what the final product price will actually be or what my cost will be, because somewhere along the road, somebody is going to come and ask me for a license. Now, the reality is that you only get that call once your company is successful, and that actually makes it worse, because then from a VC's perspective, then the question is your potential 10x or is it 5x? Because if the license you have to take, healthcare is a perfect example, right? The implementation of one technology that might be at the consumer level might lead to a product that's $5 at the shelf. In the healthcare space, where I have to go through FDA approval, I have to spend a lot of time, or I have to get a CE mark, I might be looking at a product that's $3,000, but the module or the software that I use to drive one small portion of it is the same module, whether it's on my consumer product or on my healthcare product. But if it's a percentage of the value of the final product, the value on a $3,000 retail price tag versus a $5,000 is huge. And so my members' first primary issue was this idea that they couldn't find a way clear to make sure that they had the licenses they needed. And again, earlier on, I mentioned that a big part of my members' world is opportunity to be acquired. It's, like I said, why we like intellectual property. But if you can't vouchsafe for the licenses that are key to your product, and when I say key, I mean because you are depending on a standard, not key in the traditional patent holder sense, then that makes it really hard to negotiate the value with a potential acquisitioner. So for us, it was really, the front foot was this question of any willing licensee versus access to license is, the way that we really hear that. And for our members, it really has to be any willing licensee, because they want the marketplace to release products to them that they can say, oh, great, I'll buy this from this company, that from that company, that from that company. All of them come with a license. Now I'll build something amazing new that no one has thought about to help crops in France, right? That kind of perspective is where we're coming from.
The legal uncertainty of, not only if, but even if something is coming, how much you will have to pay for such a license.
Right, and that gets into our whole fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory questions. And but you asked kind of what was the kickoff. That was the kickoff. It's like, what do you mean that it doesn't come with a license? And that was something, I think, for most of my members, a lot of whom are traditionally, are members of IEEE or some other major standards body. They've participated in standards negotiations, which are almost always dominated by, your traditional tech nerd or your engineer. And so their perspective on that is, well, we didn't necessarily pick the best technology. We picked the technology that worked for the most people going through the process. And so there was this idea that the value prop to the standard essential patent holder was either you kept you kept your patent out of the standard, in which case you could use your right to exclude, or you put it into the standard and you made your money on volume. And so there was always that understanding that was the bargain, so to speak. So that's why this issue became so troubling for our members. It felt like a change in the bargaining position of volume versus exclusivity. Sorry, you can't see my hands in there, but volume versus exclusivity.
One follow-up question on this, because I have been also interviewing some of the SMEs, and there are some standards also subject to standard essential patents where the licensing is more clear, like Bluetooth, for example. I believe you can directly acquire the chip and the rights and everything in one package. And especially for IoT, it's not like given that 5G will be the dominant standard. There's
correct.
Bluetooth, there's DECT, there's also Wi-Fi, especially when there's no voice or that bandwidth that needs a lot of data transmission.
Right. If you don't need low,
the dominant one.
Yeah, if you don't need low latency, high bandwidth, I mean, this is my favorite niche. Like I said, I come from that space. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, look, I love the big ISPs telling everybody that 5G is the best thing ever. I love it. I love low latency, high bandwidth because I'm a low latency, high bandwidth user. But if I'm using an agricultural product, I might actually want something that is super low energy, super low, not LE, but super low energy, and doesn't necessarily need to send a packet that gets there in under 50 milliseconds, right? It can be a lazy packet. The packet can drift along, so to speak. But what I probably need is robustness and low battery and the ability to transport it over great distances. So again, yeah, you're completely right. And so for IoT, oftentimes I might take a sliver of an existing larger standard to say, I need these features out of it. And that brings to another question that often gets pulled up around SEPs, which is portfolio licensing, right? So let's say I'm in a situation where I want to take a license and one of the SEP holders says, well, mighty fine product you got there. If you don't want to face litigation, you better take a license for our entire portfolio. But if I'm really only using a small segment of it, and I don't have a need for the special features that have been added for video because it's literally something that goes in the ground and pays attention to worms, I probably am not interested in your full portfolio. So this idea that you must, in order to be granted a license, take an entire portfolio is also problematic for small and medium-sized businesses. So this gets kind of back to that whole thing, back to the ability to any willing licensee. Our belief is, if it's any willing licensee, you will have market participants who will price products at different levels to meet the needs of our members, right? They will be willing to do that. They'll say, I'll make that one. And I'll do some differences in how I manufacture that silicon. So I think that's why some of these all come back to that. I mean, in general, our members support the idea of a non-SEP patent having that ability to exclude. My members depend on it. If I've got the best idea ever invented in the entire world, I might want to sell that. But again, if you've made an agreement where you say, I want volume and I want to put it in a standard and I'm going to agree to that, then we think that fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory also, as part of that, it has to have this limited or almost non-existent use of injunction, which is tied to this idea of, do I have to give you a license at all?
One of the issues always I keep hearing, and also regulators call for it now, is transparency. Because it is at least understood that there is a information asymmetry often between the net licensors and the net licensees.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that? Where do you see is that transparency yet missing?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you said, there's really two parts of this transparency question. There's price transparency, and there's this concept of what's really covered under the standard, under the patent that is submitted as a standard essential patent. So I think in both of those cases, I think in the case of what the patent covers, the ability to challenge a patent that has been proffered forth inside of a SEP, I think is valuable, and I think it's important. I love that companies are bringing their patents to the table within a standards body and putting them on the table. And I love the fact that they're willing to sign an agreement that says that they'll make them available under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. But you can get into a place where it almost becomes shovelware, where somebody says, well, all of my patents should be included. And then you pick which ones you think actually are essential to the standard. Or that's an overstatement, and I'm sure some would disagree with how I'm characterizing it, but trying not to be too glib, but it oftentimes is not where they say, this patented technology in this specific area, this is the patent number, and this is how it reads, and this is why it's essential to the patent. So I think that transparency is useful. It's especially useful for technologists because, and this is something I think we forget in all of this, we have a strong desire to consider a patent system as strictly a money producing fish wheel. And my members appreciate the fact that a patent can result in economic gain, but the actual purpose of patent systems throughout the world is to actually teach people how to do things, right? That's the bargain. In the United States, the idea is I'll give you a right to exclude. We just talked about how you trade that one a little bit, but the thing that you trade for is this fundamental idea that I'm going to show you how to do something that is new, useful, and non-obvious. And so it's that teaching element of the patent that's really critical. And so when it comes to standards, if you aren't being transparent about the way in which the patent reads on the standard, then I'm losing some of that teaching value that the patent brings. And I think that's something we forget, that's the bargain. You get these special privileges because what you're doing is new, useful, and non-obvious. And I think that transparency is most critical for the technologist who wants to understand it. And then, goodness gracious, might want to invent something even more fantastic or amazing. And of course, cite your patent or cite the patent, but then that pushes forward innovation. So to me, that's an area of transparency I think is really critical. The other side of transparency, this idea of pricing, that one's an interesting one. We kind of touched on it. This gets into this question of how much of the standard am I depending on? How much am I using? What country am I using it for? What's the economic benefit of it? So that one's a harder one to parse in some ways because thinking about my members who have standard essential patents and small businesses who have a patent that they rely on, they might enter into multiple levels of negotiation around some of those technologies. So I like transparency, but I want to be aware that there are two sides to the question on pricing, on full pricing transparency. As far as transparency around what your patent actually reads on within a standard, I think that's important because that drives innovation. So that I think is something where it's worth touching on.
Yes, thank you for elaborating on those things. One other issue, Warren, I think, point about the patent system or owning a patent is, of course, also the right to enforce your patent. But of course, when it comes to standards and, developing and kind of getting an understanding of what a FRAND rate is, in your opinion, is an injunction, can that ever be FRAND, or, in light of an injunction to negotiate a FRAND rate is difficult?
I think that there are very few moments in which an injunction is the right approach within the context of FRAND. I've been in this world long enough to say never. If you really had a truly recalcitrant participant that was absolutely never going to do it and was just standing in there and thumbing their nose at you, maybe. But I think that that it is difficult to, it should be rare, really rare. And again, this is the reality, and your listeners are so well educated in this topic that they understand it, because we can all think of a couple of case examples or a couple of opportunities where you might say that without the ability to say an injunction is possible, it's hard to get to yes. But I think that if you start from a position of injunction, then I come back to what my biggest worry about this entire topic is: if a patent in the context of a standard is no different than a patent in the context of a traditional enforcement of rights, then what's the point of a standard? I always have conversations with people on who have SEPs are like, well, you can't take away my right to exclude. And my point is, no one's taking your right to exclude. You're choosing to participate in a voluntary standards body. And I think this is really important. I use the V word, voluntary. We both know, you and I both know, that there are countries out there that appear to be trying to abuse the patent system to essentially strip people of their IP rights completely. And I think that's unacceptable. But within the context of when you sit down at that table voluntarily and you say, I have weighed the equities and I think I make more money by participating in the standard, or what I think is more common is, for all of those who are, unless you're just an NPE, most companies who participate in standards bodies are saying to themselves, this will help me sell other products, or this will serve as the underpinning for my product. And if it's interoperable with Bob's product over there or Sally's product over there, then we'll all make more money. I'll move more units. So for most participants at standards bodies, there's the technological outcome they want, which is a way to solve a problem. And then there's the business outcome they want, which is more people buying their things. So back to your question, I think that if you think of it from that frame of reference, the reason that people come voluntarily is because it has that dual benefit. Helps you move forward the technology, or it helps you make more money and through volume sales. And so I think that is the reality of why voluntary standards bodies are really critical. And the V word there, voluntary, I think is one of the most important elements.
And, I tend to have a lot of SEP holders here also on my virtual SEP couch, and they keep saying, where are the incentives for the implementers to pay if there's no pressure, or it's a typical carrot and stick problem. How do you make sure that deals happening that are FRAND, right? I think that is important, that it's a fair and reasonable non-discriminatory term and price, and no one should be forced to pay more. But how can we create incentives, you think, that these things happen?
Because the reality of businesses they want to keep their CapEx, their capital expenditures, under control, or their OpEx, if in software space, as much as possible. And so standards offer a way to create or leapfrog inventing the stuff internally. And so one of the biggest incentives for businesses to use standards is it helps you control costs. So when you say, what is my incentive to participate or pay in a standard. Now, remember, we started off with this concept of if you truly found somebody who is just absolutely never going to pay and unwilling to pay, well, then that's something we can talk about. But if it's really haggling over price, there's an incentive to get to yes, because by implementing a standard, I have to hire fewer people or spend less money on engineers. And look, I'd love it if everybody was hiring developers constantly, but my people are expensive, right? I mean, I was on the phone with one of our members who does healthcare. They were offering high school students, this is a San Diego-based company, high school students, a starting salary of $85,000 plus a $25,000 signing bonus based on their code that they'd written in high school classes. And then if you actually get somebody who's a PM, you're looking at $250,000 plus stock options and everything else. So standards do two things for you. They speed it up and they reduce some of your cost. So I think the incentives of standards are that. And then, as we discussed earlier, there's the other huge incentive, which is if your competitors are using that standard, then you darn well better have it in there too, because it's going to be a feature that customers require. We are past the era of old IBM where there was an entirely separate vertical stack controlled by one company. And if you lived in their world, you had to buy their cables and their product and their exclusive networking features, and everything was separate. I don't think you can do a business that way now. So I think the incentive to drive standards is economic. It's lowers your costs, speeds up your path to market, and it's what your customers demand. So I think that's a pretty strong incentive structure. And again, to be clear, I didn't say there would never be the right to form an injunction, but it should be pretty damn rare because you want the other features out there. And I guess to come full circle, Tim, I think that's my biggest worry. If we harm the SEP holder too much, the patent holder too much, that's bad for patents, because then everybody keeps their stuff excluded. If SEP holders can essentially exclude participants back to any willing licensee and reasonable rates under FRAND, then you start to see the big companies going back to vertical silos. I mean, IBM got rich, Microsoft got rich. There are companies that got crazy rich offering a single vertical stack with no input from anyone else. Novell before it went under. There are a lot of companies out there that if standards become impossible to get, they'll make their own. And that's a world that really is bad for my guys, because my guys depend on sneaking in the cracks, filling that gap that a Microsoft won't spend on, that a Medtronic won't spend on, that a large healthcare company won't spend on. And my guy can come in and say, hey, I can do that. We've got guys who do IoT work in the HVAC space, heating, air conditioning space, monitoring tools, whole machine learning and AI systems for climate control to reduce your energy usage. When you do it per building, it's expensive, or it would be expensive for a big HVAC company to do that. But my guy can come in and say, hey, I'll write your custom code for your building so that you have a better control over it. Now, I'm going to depend on 15 different standards in order to implement that. Wire standards, wireless standards, software standards, coding standards. But when I do it, your building will be more energy efficient. Your building will lower your costs, and it will be better for the environment. And so that's the kind of stuff that my members do, and where they're very dependent on this interwoven network of standards that allow that to be possible.
I think we can agree upon is that for IoT, not only the implementation of the standard, but also solving this licensing issue that must be simple. And we touched upon that in the very beginning. It's the legal uncertainty that worries your members right now.
Correct.
And I guess at the same time, as we said, also, there's just a few people out there in the world that know all the details about how to deal with FRAND. I mean, why would they know how to license in SEPs? So, people keep calling for simple solutions for IoT, and what is a typical one, I guess, are solutions like joint licensing programs, patent pools. What is your view on that? Is that a model that is attractive, or any opinions on pools?
Well, so the most common one we always end up talking about is Avanci, right? I mean, the Avanci patent pool is interesting. The problem is, again, the method by which Avanci enters into the game is to say, you must take all of this. I mean, it's a pool in which you have to buy into all of it. That can be expensive. And I think patent pools can be useful. It's the question that gets back to everything else we talked about. Right to exclude. What does it look like? How much am I taking on? Is it priced at the module level rather than at the $3,000 product that goes ping? Right? It all really depends on where. So, and I think it's important that I want to be clear. I think patent pools have some real opportunities for my members who have patents, who want to contribute it to a patent pool and see some remuneration. So I want to be clear that that patent pools in and of themselves are not evil or wrong or a bad idea, because they can help in those cases. It's really the uncertainty you said before about, can I get a license? What does it look like? What are those patents actually essential to the standard, that I think become questions? And what's the price Avanci wants? So that's the patent pool question. I think is one that we should continue to talk about and look at. I think it's very case specific, but I think it can be an interesting idea. It's just when it's abused that it all kind of falls apart. Frankly, almost all of this stuff comes down to that. It's how do we enable the patent system, the standard system, to move forward and make it more resistant to abuse, I think is the main thing.
I think the patent pool would be a self-regulation system that would have to meet, the incentives of both sides of the table again. But of course, what we also see these days is a lot of requests for proposals or public consultations. Regulators, if you could make a wish to a regulator, what would that be? What would you want to change in the current system, or what should be more clearly defined if you think about the system at the moment?
My magic wand. I'm thinking of my magic wand here. Well, I think we actually outlined a lot of that. We really thought that the Biden administration's offered solution on the withdrawal of the 2019 program, and then through executive order, what the president said he wanted to accomplish, really kind of pointed us in the right direction, right? It's these kind of basic concepts of, SEP owners make licenses available on FRAND terms, no discriminations on licenses, including category, industry, or location in the supply chain. We've beaten that horse to death here. That SEP owners should include factual explanations of whether the license is needed, disclosure obligations. I think that really, really critically matters. And then, frankly, the access to courts, and that a willing licensee does not become an unwilling licensee if they refuse arbitration. That's something that I think, if you ask Major, wave a wand, I don't think there's one fix, because, again, I think, and this is a part you mentioned earlier, you said implementers versus SEP holders. I think that's an artificial dichotomy, because I live in a world in between the giant 800-pound gorillas, right? Is IBM a SEP holder? Are they an implementer? Is Intel a SEP holder or an implementer? Apple, who everybody likes to sue and sues everybody, or not sues everybody, but is getting sued a lot on this stuff, actually contributes a lot of standards into the standards process. So I see a lot of the big guys in this space are on both sides of this coin. And so I want to be careful to basically say, make everything easier for my little guys. SEP holders should just give everything away for free. I'm realistic. That doesn't work. And the very same companies that are complaining on the other side would immediately then look at their portfolio and say, well, now this is the value of this has changed. So I think the system actually has to work for both sides. I think that waving the magic wand, I think it really is around how do we get back to this concept of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory in a way that actually meets both sides' goals. So that's why I think it's hard to do a single wand fix this, because it's intricate. And as your listeners know, it's fraught with case law and different country standards, right? I mean, just think about Germany versus the United States in terms of applying for a patent and the years that you go through on the United States versus a registration system. I mean, there's so many differences in the ways that various countries, whether it's the Japanese Patent Office, the USPTO, European patents. I mean, technically there are no software patents in Europe, but of course there are, as your listeners know. But I mean, even that kind of thing, so it becomes hard to just wave a magic wand.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity, and I think I always wish for more clarity here, especially because we are discussing global topics, right? I mean, this is not one country's issue or problem, even though the patents are always local, but
ultimately that's the beauty, right? That's the part that I am so excited about of all the things that we do. I have tiny member companies that have products sold in 100 countries, right? I mean, that's amazing. You and I could start a company tomorrow, hire 5 engineers, take our great idea, and within a matter of months to a year or so, we might have a global user base. And that is something that I think is amazing. And I think the standard system has helped make that possible. So none of this should be taken as breaking that down, but that's super cool, right? I mean, that a 10-man shop can have products in 110 countries. And so
and we are one of them, by the way. iPylytics is yet a small company, and we have clients all over the world, all continents but Africa, but everywhere.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there are some amazing inventions in Africa around wireless technologies. In fact, it's fascinating that when it comes to mobile banking, Africa has done more to move forward wireless banking than almost anyone else. They've taken some of the adversity of it's hard to pull copper over a country the size of some of the major continental countries on Africa. When you can't pull fiber across the desert. So how do you do mobile banking and how do you have these systems work? So I want to be clear. I'd love to see more technologies and patented technologies coming out of Africa into the standard system. I think that would be great. And I think there's a lot to offer. Certainly South Africa has already been participating, but I think sub-Saharan Africa, north of South Africa, also has many places, Niger, you name it. So I love IP systems because I think they help spur things forward.
Yeah, especially those connectivity topics are sometimes in these countries, in these less developed countries, a step like you're going 5 steps in one, right? So you don't need to have all these steps in between. Sometimes they don't even have electricity, but they have Wi-Fi. So I think that's right. Something amazing. I like about it. But great, Morgen, this has been really, really great. I like to invite people with really different perspectives on all these topics, and you did for sure provide a different perspective or a new perspective in this, which I'm always finding super fascinating. But I'm always giving the last words to you. So in your final statement, what do you want our listeners to keep remembering from you?
I think for us, it's very clear. Our goals are simple. We want to preserve and promote innovation while encouraging a healthy and robust standard system. For our members, we want a balance when it comes to how IP works. And I think that's really, I think for all of you out there in the world, you need my members to be successful because we're going to invent or build or create or monetize the next great invention that you didn't even know your life depended on. And so we need you all in the SEP community to make sure that standards work because we need to build on those standards to change the world.
That's my final statement. Thank you so much. This was Morgen Reed, the president of the App Association. Thank you so much.
Thank you.